something shifted in Cleveland, and I don't think enough people are talking about it the right way. Not the press conference version of it, not the sanitized talking points version, the real version. The version where people who get paid to watch film and form opinions actually said something honest, out loud, on the record, even though part of them clearly didn't want to. That's the version I want to get into today, because when analysts who've spent the better part of an offseason hedging, qualifying, and diplomatically avoiding the obvious finally stop hedging, that moment is worth more than 100 scheduled takes. It means something slipped through. It means the reality of the situation became too heavy to keep carrying around politely. And the reality in Cleveland right now is this: a rookie quarterback, surrounded by almost nothing, somehow made a professional football offense believe in itself. And a $30 million veteran, given every possible resource and advantage, delivered the kind of return on investment that would get a financial advisor disbarred. Those are the two poles of this conversation, and yet somehow, for months, the panel covering this team couldn't just say it plainly, until recently, until the question got asked again in a room with nowhere to hide. And the answer finally came out the way honest answers do. A little reluctant, a little surprising even to the person saying it, but unmistakably true. So let me start where this whole thing started, because the timeline actually matters here. February 17th. That date is the key. The panel is going through their quarterback room discussion, as they always do, as they have to. And Titus gets asked directly whether Shedeur Sanders can be a top 20 quarterback next year. Direct question, no room for ambiguity. And I want you to understand what it means when someone who covers football professionally, someone who watches the tape and lives in this space, refuses to answer that question. He said essentially that he wouldn't touch it until after the draft. And in the moment, you could find some logic in that. Draft capital changes things. New weapons, new blockers, new context. Fine, I gave it the benefit of the doubt. But then the draft came, and the Browns didn't just tinker around the edges. They went and made a real financial commitment to protecting that quarterback. We're talking somewhere in the range of $100 million when you add up what they put into that offensive line. Titus Howard, Zion Johnson. Names that mean something in a league where a healthy, upright quarterback is the difference between a competitive season and a dumpster fire. They brought in receiving targets: KC Conception, Denzel Boston, Isaiah Bond, guys with real upside, guys who can create separation and make contested catches. The picture cleared up significantly, and when Titus finally had to sit down and answer the question he'd been avoiding since February, what came out of his mouth wasn't the cautious non-answer I was bracing for. He said it. He said the Browns have built something real around this kid, and that yes, Shedeur Sanders can absolutely be a top 20 quarterback in 2026. Now, there was a caveat. There's always a caveat with this panel, but this particular caveat is worth spending real time on because it cuts right to the heart of everything interesting about Shedeur Sanders as an evaluative subject. The caveat was this: Shedeur has to learn to take the layup. I keep turning that phrase over in my head because it's such a precise way to describe what is simultaneously his greatest gift and his most persistent liability. He's a quarterback who, when given the option between the safe completion and the spectacular play, chooses the spectacular one. Every time, almost reflexively. And in college at Colorado, with the whole program shaped around his strengths, that tendency was electric. That was the thing that made him must-watch television. The throw into a tight window on 3rd and long, the improvised deep ball off his back foot with a defender in his face, the kind of moment that makes a defensive coordinator reconsider his life choices. It was gorgeous to watch. It was also, in the NFL context, a recipe for unnecessary suffering. Because the NFL has a tax on improvisation, it charges you for every extra half second you spend looking downfield when the check down is wide open underneath. It punishes you for going for the spectacular play when the good play is sitting right there in front of you, uncovered, begging you to take it. Shedeur's instinct is to elevate the moment, and the league's response to that instinct is defensive coordinators who specifically scheme to exploit it, defensive linemen who specifically live in that extra half second, and dropped passes on those spectacular throws that turn into punts or turnovers instead of touchdowns. Titus understood this and said it clearly. Shedeur was trusting his teammates to win those contested moments, and too often they couldn't. The ability just wasn't there yet. So you had a quarterback willing to take the shot, and a receiving core that couldn't consistently make those shots matter. That's not just a quarterback problem. That's a roster problem, a development problem, a situational problem. And now the argument is that enough of those variables have changed that the same instincts start producing different results. That's the optimistic case, and I think it's genuinely compelling. But here's where the conversation really opened up for me, where I felt like the panel stopped performing and started actually thinking out loud. Because right in the middle of all this Shedeur optimism, someone raised the Watson scenario. What happens if Deshaun Watson wins the quarterback competition? What does that world look like? And the way that question landed, the way it sat in the air for a beat before anyone answered, told me everything I needed to know about how these people actually feel about Watson underneath the diplomatic framing. Think about the architecture of that question. If Watson wins the competition, that's not a question about a foregone conclusion. That's a question about an uncertain outcome. And the fact that it was framed that way, by people who cover this team daily, by people who understand the organizational dynamics and the financial pressure and the institutional preference, that framing alone is a small bombshell if you're paying attention. They're not asking when Watson takes over or as Watson enters the season. They're asking what happens if. That single syllable carries enormous weight. It means they've already processed the possibility that this thing doesn't go the way the organization hoped. It means Shedeur Sanders is a real competitor in this race in the minds of the people watching it most closely. But then Titus went further. In addressing the Watson scenario, what Cleveland needs from him if he does win this job, he said something I genuinely didn't expect. He said Watson would need to replicate the confidence and belief that Shedeur Sanders already brought to that huddle. He said there were genuine moments last season, documented moments, where that offense felt like it could win the game. And he attributed those moments directly to Shedeur. I want you to stop and actually absorb what that means, because for most of last season, the public narrative around Shedeur was about what he couldn't do. The raw mechanics, the early mistakes, the weapons that weren't there, the line that couldn't protect him. The whole story was about limitations and development curves and managing expectations. And here's one of the people most steeped in that narrative turning around and saying that even inside all of that, Shedeur Sanders gave that team something Deshaun Watson, with his massive contract and his organizational support and his experienced roster, never consistently delivered. He gave them belief. He made them think they could win. That is not a minor thing in professional football. That is actually one of the most important intangible qualities a quarterback can possess. The ability to walk into a huddle and make 11 other human beings feel, at a gut level, that the next play is going to work, that the drive is going somewhere, that the game is still winnable even when the scoreboard says otherwise. Tom Brady built a dynasty on it. Patrick Mahomes operates in that frequency now. It's the thing that separates good quarterbacks from great ones, and it's almost impossible to manufacture. You either carry it or you don't. And Shedeur Sanders, as a rookie, with Jerry Jeudy dropping balls and the offensive line looking like it was assembled from spare parts and discount pricing, already had it, already used it, already made that offense feel something. Now compare that to the foundation you're working with on the Watson side of this ledger. $185 million. That's the number that kept surfacing throughout this entire conversation. And it kept surfacing because nobody could figure out a polite way to make it irrelevant. Dustin finally just said it straight. The money is gone, the check cleared a long time ago, and the Browns cannot use that financial commitment as a reason to hand Watson the starting job. That's the sunk cost trap. In economics, in business, in sports, the logic is identical. You don't continue investing in a failing position just because you've already lost a lot on it. You make your decisions based on what actually gives you the best return going forward, what gives you the best chance to win, not what gives you the best chance to feel better about a mistake you made 3 years ago. And when you strip away the contract and evaluate this purely on what each quarterback has demonstrated he can give this team right now, the choice stops being complicated. On one side, you have 3 genuinely good games, not 3 seasons. 3 games out of $185 million and years of organizational commitment and a fan base that bent itself into knots trying to believe. 3 good games. On the other side, you have a rookie who played behind an offensive line that couldn't reliably keep him upright, with receivers who too often couldn't win when it mattered, with a coaching infrastructure not optimally built around his development, and he still found a way to make his teammates believe. Now tell me which foundation you build on when you're trying to win football games in 2026. There was a moment in the conversation where someone offered the urgency argument for Watson, the idea being that a man staring at the end of his career, knowing this is genuinely his last real shot, digs deeper than he ever has before, that the desperation itself becomes a form of preparation, that Watson goes into this offseason camp hungry in a way he's never been hungry because the alternative is retirement and irrelevance. And I understand that argument intellectually. I've seen athletes find something real at the edge of a cliff. It happens. But I kept running into the same wall when I tried to accept it. If the competitive fire, the full commitment, the total investment in the process. If all of that only shows up when the career is literally expiring, then what exactly was Watson giving the Browns during the years when the position was secure, when the roster was constructed around his preferences, when the city was willing to forgive almost anything because the contract demanded it? What was the excuse for those seasons? That question doesn't have a flattering answer, and I think the panel knows it, even when they're being generous about Watson's potential resurrection. The Titus Monk angle is something I don't think gets enough credit in these discussions. The panel keeps coming back to the idea that he's a different kind of head coach than what Cleveland has had. More direct, more willing to say the uncomfortable thing without softening it into meaninglessness. And the specific application here is his relationship with Shedeur. The suggestion that Monk will sit down with that quarterback, look him in the eye, and tell him precisely what he needs to change without burying the message in qualifications. Take the check down, protect the football, be disciplined on third and manageable. Don't skip the good play looking for the great one. If those are the actual messages being delivered clearly and consistently, and if Shedeur has the intelligence and competitive self-awareness to receive them and act on them, which everything we've seen suggests he does, then what we're describing is an accelerated development curve for a player who was already making professional football offices believe things in his rookie year. People keep reaching for the Kevin Stefanski comparison when they talk about Watson's struggles, arguing that there was some philosophical mismatch between Watson's natural game and what that offense required. And maybe there's a grain of truth buried somewhere in there, but Baker Mayfield ran that same system and had real success in it. Baker Mayfield, who by most conventional evaluations is not a top 10 quarterback, executed the Stefanski scheme well enough to nearly reach a Super Bowl. So the argument that the system failed Watson has a significant credibility problem. The system worked. The system produced results with a different quarterback. The issue wasn't the playbook. The issue was something more fundamental. And a new coordinator, a new scheme, a new set of terminologies. None of that fixes something fundamental. What does fix things, or at least create the conditions for fixing them, is exactly what Monk apparently brings. Clarity, accountability, the kind of coaching relationship where a young quarterback actually understands his mistakes and understands what the corrected version looks like. And here's the thing that gets me most when I zoom out and look at this whole picture. Shedeur Sanders is going into his second year. His second year, he's operating on a development timeline where the biggest jumps typically come between year 1 and year 2, when the game starts slowing down, when the recognition patterns become automatic, when the physical adjustments that were conscious decisions in the rookie year become instinctive. He already gave this team belief when he was raw and surrounded by limitations. What does he give them when the game has slowed down, when the line can actually protect him, when the receivers can win those contested routes he's been trusting people to win? The tape is going to answer that question. That's the line I keep coming back to from this whole conversation. Titus said it, and there's no smarter place to land. All of the analysis, all of the contract discussions, all of the urgency narratives and scheme adjustments and offseason optimism, it all eventually gives way to the football. The ball gets snapped, the camera rolls, and the truth comes out the way it always does in this league, which is right there in front of everyone with nowhere to hide. The coaches will see it in practice, the reporters with access will write around it, and the players themselves, the offensive linemen, the receivers, the tight ends, will start gravitating toward whichever quarterback makes them feel something in a 7-on-7 drill, in a 2-minute situation at the end of practice, in the small unscripted moments that nobody outside the building ever sees but everybody inside the building remembers. Shedeur Sanders already created those moments, once, with almost nothing around him. Now he walks into that competition with Titus Howard and Zion Johnson protecting his blind side, with George Warhop scheming to unlock what that line can do at its ceiling, with receivers who can actually win the routes he's been trying to throw to since he arrived. And the panel, the same panel that wouldn't call him a top 20 quarterback before the draft, that hedged and qualified and found reasons to stay non-committal, just sat down and said out loud that they believe there's genuine greatness inside this quarterback, that the environment is now constructed to let it show, that the only question left is whether he can sustain it for 60 minutes instead of finding it in flashes. That's not a Watson story. That's a Shedeur story. The whole offseason, all the press conference language, all the institutional loyalty to the biggest contract in franchise history, and the people watching most closely still can't stop talking about the rookie. Still keep circling back to what he already showed them. Still find themselves, when they're being completely honest, describing the Watson scenario as a what if and the Shedeur scenario as a foundation. That quiet, reluctant honesty from people who live in this beat, who watch this team, who didn't go in looking to make this argument. That's the most meaningful thing to come out of Cleveland this entire offseason. More meaningful than any press conference. More meaningful than any contract restructure or scheme announcement or camp hype. The people closest to the situation have already started arriving somewhere, and where they're arriving is the same place I've been for a while now. The tape hasn't rolled yet, but when it does, I think we're all going to see exactly what those moments in last year's huddle were really telling us about Shedeur Sanders.